Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we go beyond the surface to uncover crucial insights. Today, we're tackling a story many of us think we know. The American West, the Hollywood version, settlers as the good guys, Native Americans as the bad guys, and the brave cavalry always swooping in. But what if the real story is, well, a lot more complex and, frankly, much more disturbing than those old movies?
That's exactly what Dee Brown aimed to show in his book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. It came out in 1970, a time when America was already wrestling with Vietnam, with racial issues. And this book, it presented something pretty radical, an Indian history of the American West.
Groundbreaking, really.
Absolutely. It wasn't just a book. It was a phenomenon, a bestseller. It really shook people's consciences, for over a year. It forced a kind of historical rethink, maybe long overdue. It helped people see beyond the sort of poor, subhuman stereotypes that were all over movies and TV back then.
Right.
Brown's whole point was to tell the story from the perspective of the victims, using their words whenever he could. He actually said he wanted Americans, who usually look west when thinking about this, to read this book with an eye to the east.
And that's precisely our mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack those real stories, the human side of it, the systematic injustices that really defined this period. We want to give you a shortcut to understanding what was actually at stake. So let's start right at the beginning, because, we often focus on the West, but this whole pattern, it actually started way earlier, didn't it? Right on the East Coast.
It's really striking how consistent it was right from the moment Europeans arrived. Right. Take Columbus in 1492. He lands and immediately sees the Taino people as, well, barbarians. And even though they were hospitable at first, he kidnaps 10 of them to introduce them to the white man's ways.
Introduce them.
Yeah. And it's just tragic. One of them died right after being baptized. And over the next 10 years or so, the Spanish actions were just brutal. Looting, burning villages, enslaving hundreds, slaughtering hundreds of thousands. Entire tribes like the Taino, the Arawaks, wiped out in less than a decade, mostly because of firearms and sabers, the technological advantage.
That's devastating, just incredibly swift destruction. So this early history, it really sets a terrifying template, doesn't it? This sort of initial, maybe veneer of civilizing, quickly turning into just outright destruction and land grabbing.
Exactly. It's a pattern that just echoes across the continent. It's a constant violation of trust, of basic rights, of life itself. It set a really chilling precedent.
So the Spanish definitely set that precedent. Then the English arrive in Virginia, 1607. The Powhatans there, they'd probably heard stories about these civilizing techniques, right? So how did their encounter play out? Was it different, maybe more subtle, or just brutal in a different way?
Well, initially, the strategy seemed a bit different. The English actually crowned Wahunsonacook King Powhatan and sort of persuaded him to get his people to provide food.
Yeah.
And after his daughter, Pocahontas, married John Rolfe. Well, Wahunsonacook seemed to almost identify more as English than Indian, But after he died, the Powhatans tried to push the English out. Didn't end well. They were decimated. Their numbers dropped from around 8,000 to less than 1,000. And then up in Massachusetts with the Pilgrims in 1620. It started differently, but kind of ended up in a similar place. Most of those colonists would have starved without help from friendly natives, people like Samoset and Squanto, who ironically had actually been kidnapped by an English sailor and sold into slavery before somehow making his way back.
No way.
Yeah. And Hobomab, too. These individuals apparently saw the Plymouth colonists as, like, helpless children. They taught them how to survive, shared food, shared knowledge.
It's just astonishing, isn't it? How fast that initial peace, that reliance just fell apart. Despite all that crucial help, the arrival of, quote, many more waves of white men leads to the first official land transfer in 1625. Samoset cedes 12,000 acres. And his view, like many Native Americans, was that land was like the sky, endless, belonging to no one. How did that fundamental difference in thinking about land ownership fuel the conflicts?
Oh, that was absolutely central. A huge source of misunderstanding and, well, exploitation. For many Native Americans, land wasn't a commodity. You couldn't own it like you own a tool. It was communal. So the whole idea of a deed, of buying and selling plots, was completely foreign.
Right.
And that allowed later settlers, thousands of them, to just ignore any kind of ceremony or agreement. They just took land.
Just took it.
Yeah. And this constant encroachment pushed the Wampanoag into the forests. Massasoit's son, Metacom, or King Philip, as the English called him, he saw it coming. He predicted their end. So in 1675, King Philip's war breaks out. His confederacy attacks something like 52 English settlements. But in the end, the colonists' firepower just It virtually exterminated the Wampanoags and their allies, the Narragansetts.
Exterminated.
Pretty much. King Philip was killed. His head was put on a pole and displayed publicly for 20 years.
20 years.
20 years. And his wife and son sold into slavery. So this early period, it really shows the pattern clearly. Initial dependence by the Europeans, then exploitation, total disregard for native culture, and finally just violent suppression and displacement once the native groups weren't useful anymore.
So the systematic displacement, the decimation, it obviously didn't stop on the East Coast. It just kept rolling westward, leading eventually to things like the infamous Trail of Tears. Can you walk us through that awful period?
Yeah, that pattern just continued right into the 1800s. Andrew Jackson, known to many tribes as Sharp Knife, becomes president in 1829. He already had this brutal reputation. Responsible for the deaths of thousands in southern tribes, Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creeks, Seminoles.
Sharp Knife.
And his first big message to Congress, he recommended removing all Indians west beyond the Mississippi River. And Congress went along with it. The Indian Removal Act of 1830. Then in 1834, they established what they called a permanent Indian frontier west of the Mississippi.
Permanent.
Right. Jackson even called it a final promise that would never be broken again. But, I mean, as history clearly shows, it was just another broken promise in a very long line of them.
The sheer scale of this forced migration, it's hard to even comprehend. What was the actual human cost?
Oh, the human cost was just immense. In the fall of 1838, General Winfield Scott's soldiers basically rounded up the Cherokees, forced them into camps, and then began what they called the Long Winter Trek. It's estimated that 1 out of every 4 Cherokees died. Cold, starvation, disease.
1 in 4.
Yeah. That's why it became known as the Trail of Tears. And it wasn't just the Cherokees. Other southern tribes, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, Seminoles, they were also forced off their lands. And up north, too, remnants of tribes like the Shawnees, Miamis, Ottawas, Hurons, Delawares, they were also pushed west, arriving as basically destitute refugees.
Destitute refugees.
And this permanent Indian frontier. It was supposed to be theirs forever, but almost immediately that promise was violated. First, the U.S. war with Mexico in 1847, which expanded U.S. territory. Then the California Gold Rush in 48. Thousands of white fortune seekers poured across this supposedly permanent Indian territory.
So permanent meant nothing.
It meant nothing. It just led to more conflict, more displacement. The whole idea of a permanent space for Native Americans was just constantly steamrolled by American expansionism.
That constant breaking of promises is just a gut-wrenching theme. Let's shift focus a bit to the Southwest. The Navajo faced a particularly harsh ordeal there, didn't they? Another example of this pattern.
Yes, the Navajo story is another really tragic one. They'd actually adopted a lot from the Spanish, raising sheep, goats, growing grain. They were doing relatively well. But when the Americans took over the territory, Mexicans became citizens, but Navajos didn't. Which created this impossible situation. Like, soldiers would punish Navajos for raiding Mexicans, but they wouldn't punish Mexicans for raiding Navajos, especially for stealing Navajo children, which happened.
So completely one-sided justice.
Completely. Tensions really boiled over around Fort Defiance. Soldiers let their horses graze on Navajo pastures, killed Navajo livestock if they wandered onto fort grounds. Eventually, the Navajos retaliated, attacked the fort. They thought they'd taught the soldiers a lesson, you know.
Right.
But the U.S. military just called it an act of war.
An act of war. Okay, so after that, what was the plan? What did the military leader, General Carleton, envision for the Navajos? How did he justify removing them from land they were so deeply connected to?
Carleton, or Star Chief as the Navajo called him, his plan was utterly ruthless. Move every single Navajo to a place called Bosque Redondo. Completely barren plain, totally alien to them.
Let's move them.
Just move them. And their connection to their homeland was, and is, incredibly deep. When the leader Barboncito was told this, his response was powerful. I will not go to Bosque. I will never leave my land, not even if it means my death.
Wow.
But Carleton ordered Kit Carson to lead the campaign. Now, Carson, he actually had a complex history with Native Americans, lived among them, even had an adopted Arapaho son.
So he wasn't initially anti-Indian?
Not exactly, but he seemed to eventually buy into this whole manifest destiny idea, you know, the belief that American expansion was inevitable, God ordained, whatever.
Right, manifest destiny.
So Carson followed orders. His strategy was brutal. Burn Navajo crops, kill their livestock, total scorched earth. There was retaliation, of course. A Navajo sharpshooter killed a Major Cummings.
And Bosque Redondo itself, the conditions there sound like they were deliberately designed to break their spirit. Truly horrific.
Beyond horrific. I mean, their main food source became pine nuts. They had hardly any clothing, no blankets,
Yeah, for
shelter. They had to dig holes in the sandy ground
You mentioned groundhogs and burrows earlier.
exactly, like ground logs. Crops failed constantly. Floods, drought, insects. Army rations were often spoiled. Disease was rampant. About a quarter of the entire Navajo population died there.
A quarter.
A quarter. And yet, Carleton's reports back to Washington. He described Bosque Redondo as an excellent reservation, called the prisoners just mouths and bodies.
Unbelievable.
He actually said cynically, the pittance they must be given to survive is a paltry sum in comparison to their natural inheritance. And just justified it all with the insatiable progress of our race. It's just a chilling example of official lies covering up mass suffering.
It's staggering, that disconnect between his reports and the actual reality. Was that kind of deliberate misrepresentation common in official reports back then? And what effect did it have on how people back east saw things?
Oh, it was incredibly common. And it created this dangerous cycle, right?
Yeah.
These false reports would fuel public support for these really harsh policies, making it seem like removal was necessary while completely hiding the humanitarian disaster. So for leaders like Manolito, who refused to give up, it meant their resistance was just met with more force. He held out until September 1866, finally surrendered, just completely exhausted, with only 23 warriors left.
That's 23.
Yeah. By the time he got to Bosque Redondo, though, there was a new superintendent, A.B. Norton, and Norton saw the reality. His report was scathing, condemned the black and brackish water, the bad and cold soil, said you needed constant force just to keep the Navajos there. His plea was basically, let them go back or move them somewhere they can actually survive. He listed basic needs: good water, wood for warmth, soil that could grow food.
A voice of reason, finally.
Thankfully, yes. And General Sherman actually played a key role in negotiating the 1868 treaty that finally allowed the Navajos to return home. Their journey back was apparently incredibly emotional. Seeing Albuquerque Mountain, calling it our mountain, shouting with joy when they finally reached their homeland.
I can only imagine.
But even then, it wasn't a complete victory. Many of their best pastures, their traditional grazing lands, had already been taken over by white settlers while they were imprisoned. So it just illustrates this constant struggle between the official story and what people actually live through.
Right. Okay, let's move back to the plains now, because there we see this tragic escalation that leads to one of the most notorious massacres in American history. It really lays bare the intent behind some of these policies.
Yeah, this takes us to Colorado. The Pikes Peak Gold Rush in 1858 brought thousands of miners flooding onto Indian lands. Denver City sprang up. Now, crucially, the 1851 treaty covering that area had not actually ceded that land to the U.S.
Okay, so the miners were trespassing, essentially.
Technically, yes. Then in 1861, there's the Fort Wise Treaty. But only 6 out of 44 Cheyenne chiefs were even present when it was signed. So its legality was dubious, to say the least.
Only 6.
Only 6. One chief who did sign was Black Kettle. And Colonel Greenwood gave him a big U.S. garrison flag, promising him as long as that flag flew over them, no soldier would ever fire upon them. And Black Kettle, trusting this, flew that flag proudly over his tippy.
He flew that flag, believing it was his shield. That level of trust, given everything else?
Yeah.
It's hard to fathom. What series of events turned that very flag into a symbol of, well, absolute betrayal?
It's a horrifying sequence. The Colorado governor, Evans, put out a notice telling friendly Indians to go to Fort Lyon for safety. Seems okay, right? But secretly, he told his agent, a little powder and lead is the best food for them.
Oh my.
Yeah. Black Kettle, trusting the governor, took his people to camp near Fort Lyon at Sand Creek. Then a Major Anthony replaces the previous commander, who was sympathetic. Anthony immediately cuts off their rations. But then he reassures Black Kettle, tells him he'll be safe if they just stay put at Sand Creek.
So mixed messages, deliberate deception.
Absolutely. Then, November 29th, 1864, Colonel Chivington arrives with his troops. He wasn't subtle about his intentions, openly talked about collecting scalps, wanting to swim in blood. Some of his own officers, Captain Silas Soule, Lieutenants Kramer and Connor, they actually protested, called it murder in every sense of the word.
He protested.
They did, but Chivington ignored them. At dawn, they attacked. Black Kettle quickly raised both the American flag he'd been given and a white flag of surrender, told his people not to be afraid. Another chief, White Antelope, 71 years old, unarmed, just stood there and sang his death song, Nothing Lives Long, Only the Earth and the Mountains, before he was shot down.
Just sang his death song.
And what followed was just unspeakable, indiscriminate slaughter. Men, women, children. The soldiers didn't just kill, they mutilated the bodies horribly, scalping everyone, cutting off genitals. They apparently used white antelopes for a tobacco pouch, cutting open a pregnant woman, shooting a 6-year-old girl who was holding a white flag, killing a 5-year-old girl. 2 soldiers found hiding in the sand.
It's just monstrous.
It is. And Chivington's justification for killing children, he recordedly said, lice hatch from eggs.
Lice hatch from eggs. That statement just reveals everything, doesn't it? The complete dehumanization. So, Sand Creek. What was the immediate impact and the lasting effect on the Cheyenne and Arapaho?
Immediately. At least 105 women and children and 28 men lay dead. Black Kettle and his wife somehow survived, but she was badly wounded. And the massacre just shattered the Cheyenne. It split them again. Some, like the relatives of William Bent, joined the northern Cheyennes up in the Powder River country, seeking resistance. Others, like Black Kettle himself, still clung to the hope of peace and moved further south. But Sand Creek basically deepened the distrust, fueled the desire for revenge in many, and pushed people towards more desperate resistance. It was a point of no return for many.
But even after something like Sand Creek, the spirit of resistance wasn't entirely crushed. Up in that Powder River country you mentioned, a different kind of war started, led by Red Cloud, a different approach to defiance.
Exactly. The Powder River country was incredibly important prime hunting grounds for the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Red Cloud, an Oglala Sioux leader, was absolutely determined to protect it. So Red Cloud's War, 1866 to 68, it was fought specifically over the Bozeman Trail, a route settlers were using to get to goldfields in Montana, right through Sioux territory, and the forts the Army was building to protect that trail.
Oh, okay.
There was this incredibly dramatic moment at Fort Laramie. Peace talks were supposed to be happening, and right in the middle of it, Colonel Carrington shows up with 700 soldiers, announcing he's there to build those forts.
During peace talks.
During the talks, another chief, Standing Elk, warned him flat out, "You will have to fight the Sioux warriors if you go there." Then Red Cloud stood up and gave this powerful speech. He basically called out the commissioners for talking peace while bringing in soldiers to take the land by force. He declared, "I would rather die fighting than starve." Then he walked right past Carrington, pointedly ignoring him. It was a clear signal. We're done talking, we're fighting.
Wow, powerful moment.
And his defiance led to major victories. The most famous is the Fetterman fight, December 66. The warriors, using clever tactics, Crazy Horse led a decoy party, lured Captain Fetterman and his entire command, 81 men, into a perfect ambush, wiped them all out.
Annihilated the whole command. So Red Cloud's strategy was clearly working.
Right.
How did he use those victories? What does his success tell us about the power dynamics then?
Red Cloud was strategically brilliant. After the Fetterman victory, he basically besieged the remaining forts along the Bozeman Trail all winter, cut off their supply lines, effectively making the soldiers prisoners in their own forts. Ted, the troops inside suffered terribly. These were often galvanized Yankees, former Confederate prisoners or Union deserters who'd enlisted. Many died from scurvy, malnutrition, pneumonia. The conditions were awful.
So he put immense pressure on the Army.
Immense pressure. And it worked. It convinced the U.S. government that fighting Red Cloud was too costly. They decided they had to negotiate. So the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty was actually pretty unique. For once, the U.S. negotiators came in under strict orders to actually seek peace and agree to abandon the forts.
He actually agreed to abandon the forts?
They did. Red Cloud made them prove it before he'd even sign. He waited until the soldiers actually left. But even then, while the treaty guaranteed the Sioux their sacred Black Hills and the Powder River country, the other details, the other 16 articles, they remained points of contention. Chiefs like Spotted Tail later said, every word proved false.
So another treaty with questionable long-term value.
Pretty much. Red Cloud did eventually get his own agency, a designated area, but even that kept getting moved around later. Still, Red Cloud's war showed that determined, unified Native resistance could, occasionally, force the U.S. government to back down, at least temporarily. It was a rare victory, though.
Right, a rare victory in a sea of defeats. Now, amidst all this conflict, all this betrayal, there's actually a brief moment, a kind of hopeful experiment in U.S. Indian policy, wasn't there? A point where maybe a different path seemed possible?
There was. That was the appointment of Donehogawa Elias Parker as Commissioner of Indian Affairs. He was Seneca, the first Native American to hold that position. Parker had faced incredible prejudice his whole life. He couldn't even become a lawyer in New York just because he was Indian.
Seriously?
Seriously. But he became a successful civil engineer, and during the Civil War, he became close friends with Ulysses S. Grant, served on his staff.
Ah, the Grant connection.
Exactly. So when Grant became president, he appointed Parker. Grant genuinely seemed to believe Parker could manage Indian affairs more intelligently and fairly than any white man. And Parker was really enthusiastic. He tried hard to reform the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was notoriously corrupt. He even started the Quaker policy, appointing agents who were recommended by religious groups, hoping they'd be more honest.
Parker's appointment sounds like it should have been a turning point, a real chance for reform from someone who actually understood the issues. But his efforts were undermined, weren't they? What was really behind the attacks on him? What does that reveal about the resistance to change inside the government?
Well, he faced huge obstacles. The Indian Agency was seen by many politicians as a source of patronage, jobs and contracts for their buddies. They didn't want reform.
Communism.
Big time. Plus, powerful interests in the West opposed him, especially when he tried to protect Sioux treaty lands, like stopping the Bighorn mining expedition. His enemies even deliberately delayed funding for Indian supplies, forcing Parker to buy things on credit, which technically violated some minor regulations.
Setting him up to fail.
Pretty much. That gave them an opening to accuse him of fraud and imprudence. The first public attack actually came from a guy named William Welsh, who had been on the board of Indian commissioners. Welsh basically accused Parker of being uncivilized, one step away from barbarism, because Parker tolerated traditional native religions.
So religious intolerance and racism fueling the attacks.
Absolutely. Parker was eventually cleared of all the charges in an investigation, but he felt his staying on would just hurt his people and embarrass President Grant, so he resigned. His story really highlights how difficult it was for even a highly qualified, well-connected Native American to make real change within that system. Entrenched interests, political corruption, and deep-seated prejudice just pushed back too hard.
What a loss. Okay, the story then shifts again back to the desert Southwest, home of the Apache, who fought this incredibly long guerrilla war for like a quarter of a century. Their story is another stark example of broken trust, isn't it?
It really is. It arguably starts in earnest with the Bascom Affair in 1861. It was all misunderstanding over some stolen cattle and a kidnapped boy. But Lieutenant Bascom took Cochise's family hostage. Cochise escaped, and then this brutal cycle of revenge started executions, mutilations on both sides. It tragically shifted the Chiricahua Apache's primary enemy from the Spanish, who they'd fought for generations, squarely onto the Americans.
Just from one incident.
That incident ignited it. Then came the murder of Mangus Colorados, another great Apache war chief. He was about 70 years old. He was lured to a meeting under a flag of truce.
A white flag.
A white flag. But he was seized, tortured by soldiers heating their bayonets in the fire and poking him, and then shot dead while supposedly trying to escape. This was under the orders of General Joseph West.
Betrayed under a flag of truce, tortured, murdered. How did that specific event shape Apache resistance? Did it just cement their distrust?
Absolutely. It made any future trust almost impossible. It fueled decades of bitter warfare. Then you have the Camp Grant massacre in 1871. A band of Aravaipa Apaches, led by Escamizan, were living peacefully near Camp Grant. They were actually building trust with the commander there, Lieutenant Whitman.
So trying peace again.
Trying peace again. But some citizens in nearby Tucson reportedly worried that peace would mean less military spending in the area, organized a mob of Americans, Mexicans, and Popko mercenaries. They attacked the peaceful, unarmed Apache camp at dawn, killed 144 people, mostly women and children, mutilated the bodies horribly.
Another massacre of non-combatants.
Exactly. Escamizan survived, and his quote just captures the tragedy. The Apaches have no one to tell their story.
Heartbreaking.
But later, there's an interesting turn. General George Crook comes back to Arizona in 1882, and the source says he was a very different man. He'd apparently learned that Indians were human beings.
He had a change of heart.
Seems so. He started implementing really progressive reforms for the time. Let Apaches choose where to live on the reservation, gave them contracts to supply hay and wood to the army, bought their surplus crops for cash, allowed them a degree of self-governance, and importantly, he publicly exposed how corrupt agents and other unscrupulous whites were stealing the rations meant for the Apaches.
He called out the corruption.
He did. Crook also realized how much the frontier newspapers distorted everything. He said they published exaggerations and falsehoods about Indians, while the Indian side is seldom given public notice. He saw how this created false ideas and actually encouraged conflict, because conflict meant profits and land grabs for some. His understanding of that media bias is really insightful.
Crook's evolution and his insight into the media's role, that's a rare perspective from that side. So given this whole backdrop, promises, betrayals, massacres, occasional reforms, What did it all mean for Geronimo? He's probably the most famous Apache leader. How did this environment shape his choices?
Geronimo's story perfectly captures that cycle. He surrendered to Crook at one point, based on promises of fair treatment.
Believing Crick's promises.
He seemed to trust Crook, yes, but then he escaped again. Why? Partly because traders got him and others drunk, but also because rumors spread lies. The source calls them that the white citizens in Arizona were definitely going to hang them if they stayed.
So constant fear of betrayal.
Constant and probably justified fear of betrayal. His life was this pattern: seeking peace, getting promises, fearing or experiencing betrayal, escaping, fighting again. It just shows how incredibly difficult, almost impossible it was to build lasting trust in that environment of relentless deception and violence.
Yeah, a seemingly endless cycle. Now, while the Apaches were fighting in the desert, back on the plains, tribes like the Comanche and Kiowa faced a different but equally existential threat: the deliberate destruction of the buffalo.
Yes, the buffalo was everything to them. Their entire way of life revolved around it. The Comanche leader, Ten Bears, gave this incredibly moving speech rejecting the idea of reservations and farming. He said, "I was born on the prairie where everything breathed freely. I want to die there, not within walls." He mourned the vanishing buffalo, killed by whites, as he put it, not for food. They have left them to rot where they fall.
Just killing for sport or to destroy their livelihood.
Exactly. After a battle called the Washita Massacre, General Sheridan laid down the law: surrender completely or face extinction. This led to the capture of 3 prominent Kiowa chiefs: Satanta, Satank, and Big Tree. They were put on trial. Satanta gave this defiant speech to General Sherman right before being arrested, and Satank, as they were taking him away in chains to prison, started singing his death song, managed to attack a guard, and was shot dead. He chose death over imprisonment.
Choosing death over prison. So even when forced onto reservations, the Kiowas and Comanches didn't just give up their identity, did they? They resisted assimilation fiercely. What does that tell us about their core values?
It shows how deeply ingrained their traditional way of life was. They absolutely resisted farming. They saw it as women's work, totally alien to their culture as nomadic hunters. What they wanted was ammunition so they could hunt buffalo, the few that were left.
Right.
At a big Sundance gathering in 1870, the warriors were all talking about trying to live freely again, in abundance with the buffalo, instead of staying on the reservation with the meager government handouts. This led to the rise of leaders like Quanah Parker, a Comanche of mixed heritage, leading the Quahati band who had never signed a treaty. And there was a prophet, Izatai, who claimed he had medicine that could stop bullets.
Stop bullets.
Yeah. He inspired an attack on a buffalo hunter's outpost called Adobe Walls in 1874. But Izatai's magic didn't work. The hunters had superior rifles and held them off. Quanah Parker reportedly never trusted a witch doctor again after that failure.
A hard lesson.
A very hard lesson. Their last real refuge was Palodoro Canyon in Texas, a place they called the Place of the Sacred Trees. Indians and the remaining buffalo herds gathered there. They lived sustainably, using every single part of the buffalo they hunted.
Sustainable living, unlike the commercial hunters.
Exactly. But the Army launched a final campaign. 5 columns of soldiers converged on the canyon, thousands of troops against just a few hundred Indians who only wanted to keep their buffalo and live out their lives in freedom. The Army destroyed their camps and supplies, scattered the people, and captured their horse herds. The destruction of the buffalo herds was ultimately a deliberate military tactic to force the Plains tribes onto reservations by destroying their food source and their way of life.
Deliberately targeting the buffalo, their sacred life source. That's grim. What was the final outcome for the Comanche and Kiowa leaders and their people? What does their fate signal about the end of the Plains Indian Wars?
It was a swift and tragic end for that way of life. The great Kiowa and Comanche leaders met terrible fates. One named Jumping Bird died mysteriously. Another, Mamanti, predicted Jumping Bird wouldn't live long, and then died himself. Satanta, the defiant orator, was imprisoned again and committed suicide by jumping from a window. Lone Wolf died too. The source sums it up starkly. The great leaders were gone. The mighty force of the Kiowas and Comanches was broken. The buffalo they had tried to save were gone. It had all happened in less than 10 years.
Less than 10 years.
Less than 10 years. Their rapid decline just underscores how devastatingly effective the U.S. strategy of destroying their resource base and military power really was. It was the end of their freedom on the plains.
Which brings us, tragically, to the Black Hills, sacred ground, and to the final, devastating chapter of this whole period, marked by desperation, spirituality, and ultimately brutal suppression.
Yes, the Black Hills Pahasapa. To the Sioux, it was the center of their world, incredibly sacred, and the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty had guaranteed it to them forever.
Forever, another promise.
Another promise, broken almost immediately. First by gold miners sneaking in, then blatantly by General Custer's military expedition in 1874, basically an armed invasion of their sacred land looking for gold without their consent.
Just marched right in.
Marched right in.
Yeah.
Then in 1875, the government sent a commission to try and buy the Black Hills. Their offer was insulting. $400,000 a year for the mineral rights, or $6 million outright.
How much gold came out of there eventually?
Estimates are around $500 million, so $6 million was nothing.
Practically theft.
Exactly. At the council, Little Big Man, who was representing Crazy Horse, actually threatened to kill any chief who agreed to sell. And Spotted Tail spoke for many when he said firmly, the Black Hills were not for rent or sale.
They refused to sell.
They refused. And the 1868 treaty specifically said any further land cessions required agreement from 3/4 of all adult male Sioux.
They never got that agreement.
So legally, the land wasn't sold. Legally, no. But Congress just ignored the treaty, ignored the Sioux's refusal. They basically forced the sale through an act of Congress. They threatened to cut off all food rations, forcibly move the tribes south, and take away all their horses and weapons if the chiefs didn't sign the new agreement. And once that government machinery started rolling, the source calls it an inexorable, irrational, and uncontrollable force. They set a deadline, February 1st, 1876. All hostile Indians, meaning those not living at an agency, had to report to a reservation by that date.
In the middle of winter.
In the middle of deep snow and blizzards. It was practically impossible for many bands out hunting to comply, even if they wanted to. Around this time, Sitting Bull had his famous Sundance vision. He saw soldiers falling like locusts into the Lakota camp, a gift from Wakantanka, the Great Spirit, to be killed.
Setting an impossible deadline like that, in winter, it feels deliberately provocative, designed to create conflict. How did the Army then use events like Sitting Bull's vision, and especially the Battle of Little Bighorn, to justify escalating their campaign?
Little Bighorn, June 1876, where Custer Longhair, as the Indians called him, and his entire immediate command were killed, became the ultimate justification for the Army. It was spun as a savage massacre that needed avenging, ignoring the fact that Custer had attacked the village first. Indian accounts, by the way, talk about soldiers begging for mercy during the battle, and several different warriors later claimed to have been the one who killed Custer White Bull, Rain in the Face others.
Right, the Custer's last stand narrative.
Exactly. And the Army's retaliation after Little Bighorn was swift and harsh. General Mackenzie went to the reservations, disarmed the Indians already living there peacefully, seized all their horses, thousands of them, and gave many to Pawnee mercenaries who served as Army scouts.
Punishing people who weren't even at the battle.
Yes. Forcing Sioux men to walk miles to Fort Robinson as a deliberate degradation. It was collective punishment. Then, years later in 1890, the ghost dance religion emerges. Started by a Paiute prophet named Wovoka, it promised a renewal. The ancestors would return, the buffalo would come back, the white people would disappear, and the earth would be restored.
A message of hope, then.
A message of hope. And importantly, Wovoka preached nonviolence and brotherly love. Part of the belief involved wearing special ghost shirts, which they thought could stop bullets.
Stop bullets?
Yeah. But the government agents on the reservations, they saw this peaceful religious revival as a threat, especially Agent McLaughlin at Standing Rock, White Hair, they called him. He thought it was harmful to a people on the threshold of civilization. He saw it as backward movement.
Fear of the unknown or losing control?
Probably both. Sitting Bull's position was interesting. He apparently didn't personally believe the dead would literally return, but he defended his people's right to dance, saying they'd be despised if they didn't participate in this hopeful movement. But his tolerance of it made him a target.
And this growing fear and misunderstanding surrounding the ghost dance ultimately leads to Sitting Bull's death. It wasn't in battle, was it? Can you describe those final tragic moments?
No, it wasn't battle. It was essentially an assassination. December 15th, 1890. Agent McLaughlin ordered Sitting Bull's arrest. He sent 43 Indian police Lakota men working for the agency to surround Sitting Bull's cabin before dawn. Sitting Bull was woken up, seemed willing to go peacefully at first, but as he was being let out, a scuffle broke out between the police and Sitting Bull's supporters. In the chaos, the police shot and killed Sitting Bull. The Army cavalry, men as backup, arrived after he was already dead.
Killed by his own people working for the agency.
A deeply tragic irony, and his death directly led to the final horror, Wounded Knee. Just 2 weeks later, December 29th, Bigfoot's band of Minneconjou Lakota many of whom were Sitting Bull's followers or just people fleeing the chaos after his death. Mostly women, children, and old or sick men were trying to reach the Pine Ridge Agency, seeking safety.
Seeking refuge.
Seeking refuge. The Army intercepted them, forced them to march to Wounded Knee Creek, and camped them there, surrounded by soldiers and Hotchkiss guns, early machine guns. The next morning, the soldiers demanded they hand over all their weapons. Most were complying. But then one man, Black Coyote, who was reportedly deaf, didn't understand or refused to give up his new rifle. He wrestled with soldiers, and a shot went off.
And that was the spark.
That was the spark. The soldiers opened fire indiscriminately. The Hotchkiss guns on the hill overlooking the camp just poured rounds into the crowd. Men, women, children shot down like buffalo, as survivors later said. One survivor, Louise Weaselbear, remembered, "We tried to run, but they shot us like we were buffalo." Another, Dewey Beard, saw his wife and baby killed. It was a slaughter.
Just firing into the camp.
Firing into the camp. Hundreds were killed. The soldiers left many of the bodies where they fell. Days later, a burial party found them frozen in the snow. Wounded Knee wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. And it became the symbol for the absolute end of Indian freedom, the final crushing blow.
That image, the frozen bodies, it's just haunting. A brutal end to that entire era. What makes Wounded Knee so symbolically powerful, even today, for Native Americans?
It represents the final violent act of subjugation. The end of armed resistance, the end of the ghost dance hope, the forced acceptance of reservation life under total government control. It encapsulates all the broken promises, the violence, the loss of sovereignty, the deep injustice they suffered. It's a scar on the land and in memory. And perhaps we should touch on one last harrowing story that exemplifies this systematic destruction. The Cheyenne Exodus. Yes, that's another incredibly painful story. After Little Bighorn, many northern Cheyenne, including Chiefs Little Wolf and Dull Knife, surrendered. In 1877, they were forcibly removed from their northern homeland down to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma.
Moved south, away from their lands.
Exactly. And the conditions there were terrible for them. Food was scarce and poor quality. They got sick malaria, chills and fevers, constant aches. As one said, our people were dying, dying, dying. They pleaded to go back home, back north. But the agent there, Agent Miles, and the Secretary of the Interior, Carl Schurz Big Eyes, ignored them. Schurz unbelievably dismissed their desperate pleas as just the chiefs trying to keep up the old traditions.
Just willful ignorance of their suffering.
Utterly. So finally, in September 1878, Little Wolf made the decision. He told Agent Miles, "We cannot stay another year. We want to go now. Before another year is up, we may all be dead." He promised they wouldn't attack settlers unless they were attacked first. They just walked off the reservation, heading north. About 300 people.
Just walked off, heading home.
Heading home. It was an epic, brutal journey. Pursued relentlessly by thousands of soldiers, they fought skirmishes, evaded capture, traveled hundreds of miles. Eventually, the band split. Dull Knife's group, mostly older people, women and children, surrendered near Fort Robinson in Nebraska, exhausted and freezing, hoping for mercy.
Hoping for mercy.
But mercy wasn't given. They were imprisoned. When they refused to agree to go back south, the commanders at the fort, under direct orders from General Sheridan and Secretary Schurz, locked them in freezing barracks with no food, water, or heat, trying to force them to submit.
Trying to starve them into submission?
Essentially, yes. After days of this, the Cheyenne decided they'd rather die fighting. They broke out of the barracks in a desperate bid for freedom. Most were hunted down and killed in the snow. Little Wolf's group managed to continue further north. He eventually met an Army officer he trusted, Lieutenant Clark Whitehat. But after hearing what happened to Dull Knife's people, Little Wolf was very reluctant to give up his weapons. Eventually, his warriors were persuaded to enlist as Army scouts. But the source notes that life at the fort, especially access to whiskey, eventually destroyed Little Wolf. It broke his spirit.
A desperate attempt to go home, met with imprisonment, starvation, massacre, and for the survivors, a kind of spiritual destruction. Looking back at this whole sweep of history, from Columbus to Wounded Knee, from the East Coast to the West, what's the main takeaway? What's the most critical thing for us, for you listening, to understand?
I think the source itself offers a really poignant summary for the Cheyenne, but it speaks to the broader experience. The Cheyennes had lost their strength. In the years since Sand Creek, doom had stalked the fair folk. The seed of the tribe had scattered with the wind. Soon there would be no one left to care to remember, no one to speak their names now that they were dead. Oh no. The critical takeaway, I think, is recognizing the sheer scale and the systematic nature of the destruction. It wasn't just random battles. It was a deliberate process driven by expansion, greed, racism, and profound failure to honor treaties or basic human dignity. It's a history filled with immense loss and unimaginable suffering. But it's also, incredibly, a history of resilience, of resistance, and of an enduring connection to land, culture, and tradition that persists even today.
It really is. This deep dive into Dee Brown's work, looking through the eyes of those who lived it, it certainly reveals a side of American history that's often just glossed over, or worse, romanticized. It's a story of relentless expansion, yeah, but also of countless broken promises and just profound human suffering.
Absolutely. And if you connect it to the bigger picture, it's such a stark reminder that history usually is written by the victors. Dee Brown's book was so important because it acted as this crucial corrective. It gave voice to people who had been silenced for so long. It revealed the enormous human cost of what was called progress. And, the values of many native cultures, the deep connection to the land, the emphasis on community, their bravery and resistance. These are for really profound insights for us, even now.
Yeah.
Especially when we think about things like environmentalism, sovereignty, and what social justice really means.
That's a powerful point, and it leaves us with a question for you, our listener. Knowing these hidden truths, this perspective, how does it shift your understanding of American history? And maybe more importantly, what echoes of these conflicts, these broken promises, these power dynamics, do you still see playing out in the world around us today? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope it's given you a clearer, maybe more challenging, but ultimately more nuanced understanding of this critical, often painful period in history.